Hello, today we'll be going over the educational code force round number 90, problem C, pluses and minuses solution. So in this problem, you're given a T number of test cases, and for each test case, you're given a string of pluses and minuses. Then they ask you to perform this pseudocode on each string. So just to briefly go over what the pseudocode does is, let's say we take a string from the sample input, minus, minus, plus, minus. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a counter. So over here, I've just quickly labeled the indexes, which are 1 based, of this string. So we have our counter equal to 0, and what we're going to do is we're going to run through the string. Every time you see a negative sign, we're going to subtract 1 from counter, and every single time you see a positive sign, we're going to add 1. So we run through the first time. We immediately start out with a negative sign, so counter becomes -1. Once counter becomes a negative number, we're going to stop the program and add the indexee to our answer. So we're going to have our answer equal to 1. So now we're going to go back and we're going to re-go through the entire array. But instead of having counter equal to 0, we're going to increment counter by 1. So now counter is equal to 1. So if we go through the array again, we see the first minus sign brings counter to 0. And then we go to a second minus sign. This brings counter to -1. Once again, counter is a negative number at indexing number 2. So we're going to add 2 to the answer. Now we're going to repeat this process one more time, or how many more times we need, until we go through the entire string without having to exit. So if we set counter equal to 2 in this example, then we go 1, 0, plus sign, we add 1 to counter, and then we have another minus sign, so then we subtract 1 from counter. So in this example, counter is never negative. It always says non-negative. And at the end, we have our number 0. So therefore, we're just going to add the entire, all 4 elements, because we were able to go through all 4 elements. And once we are able to go through the entire string without having to exit due to a negative number, we can just print out our answer, which is 7. Now let's go over the solution to this problem. So if we assume that we can run the pseudocode for all test cases for the string of length up to 10 to the power 6, we'll notice that we will get a time limit exceeded. And if you actually try the solution, you should get a time limit exceeded on pretest number 5. So we have to look at a way where we don't actually bash it. And we can actually do this using linear runtime, where we just go through the entire string once. So how can we do this? Well, we know that every time we hit a negative sign, or where the value of counter becomes negative, we just add the indexee to the answer, and then we can continue on our way with counter plus 1. So let's look at how we can do this. So when counter is equal to 0 on the first element, we see that as a negative sign. So counter will be a -1. So seeing how counter is -1, we know that we must add the indexee to our answer, which we have done over here. So now we can just add 1 to counter and assume that counter is now equal to 1. So if counter is equal to 1, then we know that at position 1, where it's a negative, it'll become 0 instead. Then at position 2, it goes back to -1. So then we add 2 to our answer. However, we do not actually have to go back and reset counter. At the position, first time, when we add the 1 to the answer, we can just immediately add 1 to counter at this point, and then move on to the second one. And the reason why we can do this is because we see this minus sign, it never changes. So if we start counter equal to 0, after we go through the minus sign, it will always reduce by 1. Even if we set counter equal to 1, again, after you go through the minus sign, it will always reduce by 1. So no matter what, this minus sign never changes. So instead of having to go and redo it and increment counter at the beginning, we can actually just increment it at any point in time. So in this case, if we increment it after we go through the first indexee, it becomes a 0. And then it goes back to a -1. Because we have another minus sign here. So then we know that if it's a -1 again, we must add the indexee 2 to our answer, which we have done over here. And then we continue. We see that since it is negative, let's increment it by 1 again. So then we move on to 3. It becomes a 1. Why? Because after we increment -1 plus 1, we have 0. And then 0, we have a plus sign here, so it becomes a 1. And then here, we don't actually have to do anything because counter is not negative. So then we just move on to 4. It becomes 0. And since counter is not negative, we don't do anything again. So now we have our answer should be equal to 1 plus 2. However, we forgot about the 4 in this case, and we never add 4 in our run-through. However, in any case, we notice that the entire pseudocode program terminates once we have gone through the entire string once. So in all cases, we have to go through the entire string once. So we have to add that part at the end. So we have to add the length of the string after we do this program. So then after we sum up everything, we get our answer of 7. In case that was slightly confusing, I'm going to go over one more example, but if you got it, you can always skip ahead to the code, which will be presented after this example. So let's look at this another example where we have the string minus minus plus plus minus minus minus. So let's go through a run through of our solution. So we start with counter equal to 0. We see the first one, it becomes -1. So at this point, at our answer, we're going to add a 1. And then we're going to look at our counter. We see a -1. So we're just going to add a 1. And then we're going to move on to the next one, which becomes 0. So whenever we increment counter by 1, what this tells us is that we cannot go through the entire string with counter equal to 0 over here. And we were only able to get up to index C1 with counter equal to 0. So you add that to our answer, and then we increment counter by 1 to see how much further we can go. So if we increment it by 1, we see that we have another -1 over here. So at this point, we know that in having counter equal to 1, the maximum distance we'll be able to go to is at index C2. So then we again add 1 to counter to see how much further we can go, because we want to complete through the entire array. So then over here, it becomes a 1. And since counter is not negative, we can continue. Becomes a 2, counter is not negative. Becomes a 1, counter is not negative because we subtract 1. Becomes a 0. And then here it becomes a -1 again. So therefore, with counter being equal to 2, we were able to clear this entire section until we got to a -1 again. So now we see that at position 7, it becomes a -1 again. So we have to add this index 7 to our answer. And then at the end, we know that we always have to add the length of the string to our answer. The length of this string is 7. So we add an additional 7 to our answer. Because we know that at the end, in order for the entire program to terminate, we have to go through the entire string once. So we add this going through the entire string once as all 7 indices in this example. So our total becomes 3 plus 14 or 17. And that is the answer for this string. Now let's quickly go over the solution to this problem. I didn't think the problem was too hard if the code is too long, so let's just go over a run through of the code. So we have our integer t and input into t. Then for the t test cases, we create a string s and input into s. What this string s is basically the string of pluses and minuses. And then here we have 2 variables. One variable is the answer, which is basically what we're going to print out, the sum of all the indices. And then the second one is total. This total is basically the exact same as our counter in the examples I showed you for the solution. So we're just going to pretty much code out the entire solution. So we're going to go through the string of pluses and minuses, and every time we see a plus, we're going to add to total. That's what this line of code does. Every single time we see a negative or a minus, we're going to subtract from total. So every time total becomes less than 0, we know that the current value of counter which we set does not work. So then we need to add 1 to the counter, or add 1 to total, and we're going to add the indice to our answer, as we've done in our solution. And then it's going to keep on going to see how much further we can go. If it again comes across another negative, we're going to add 1 to total, add that indice, and then we're going to keep going until we reach the end of the array. Then at the end of the string, we're going to add the string's length, because then we know that we've gone through the entire string once. So we add that entire length to our answer. If we submit this code, we do see that it is accepted.